I still remember the weight of that day, the cold air, the smell of wet flowers, and the silence that felt almost rehearsed. Everyone stood still around my mother's grave, pretending to mourn a woman most of them had already forgotten. I stood there too, trying to cry, but my eyes were dry. I wasn't sure if it was grief or confusion. My son, Daniel, stood beside me, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the ground. He looked impatient, as if the funeral was an inconvenient pause in his schedule. I noticed the way he avoided my gaze, like there was something between us that neither of us wanted to name. I should have paid attention to that. When the priest finished his words, the lawyer approached me. A thin man with pale hands and a voice that trembled more than mine. He handed me a sealed envelope and said, "Your mother asked that you read this privately." My hands were shaking when I took it. It wasn't the weight of grief, it was something heavier. A premonition. As people left, I stayed behind, staring at the stone that now carried only one word: Mother. No name, no date. Just that, as if even in death, she wanted to keep her secrets hidden. I felt the first tear fall, not because she was gone, but because I realized she'd never really let me in while she lived. I slipped the envelope into my coat pocket and whispered, "I'll read it when I'm ready." But deep down, I already knew no one is ever ready to face the truth their mother hides. That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain tapped against the window like an impatient reminder that something waited for me on the dresser. The envelope. My mother's handwriting stared back at me, delicate, controlled, the same script she used on birthday cards and warnings alike. It carried love and authority in the same stroke. I lit a small lamp and sat down. My heart was restless, the kind of restlessness that whispers "don't do it" while your hands already begin to move. The seal broke with a soft crack, and inside there was not just a letter, but another folded paper, a legal document. Her will. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. Her letter began gently. "My dear Anna, if you are reading this, I am gone. I hope you can forgive the silence I kept all these years." My throat tightened. She wrote about regret, about things left unsaid, about the burden of protecting the ones we love from truths they're not ready to face. And then she ended abruptly. "When you read the will, you'll understand." I unfolded the second paper. My eyes ran down the lines faster than my mind could follow, and then I stopped. Everything she owned, every piece of land, every cent, was left to Daniel. My son. Not a single word about me. Just a final line. "Forgive me when you find out why." I dropped the paper on the table, my chest tightening, my breath uneven. I felt betrayed, not just by my mother, but by something bigger, as if the universe itself had decided I didn't deserve answers. What kind of truth could justify a wound like that? The next morning, Daniel came earlier than usual. He didn't even knock, just opened the door and stepped inside as if the house already belonged to him. His tone was casual, almost rehearsed. "Did you read it?" he asked, pretending to care, but his eyes went straight to the envelope on the table. I tried to sound calm, though my hands still trembled. "Yes, I did," I said quietly. He smiled, not the smile of a son comforting his mother, but of someone confirming a deal. "Then I guess you understand now," he whispered, pouring himself a cup of coffee without asking. That small gesture told me everything I needed to know. He already knew. I asked him when he found out, but he just shrugged. "Grandma trusted me," he said. His words cut through me sharper than any blade. My own mother had confided in him, the very person she'd raised me to protect. I felt small, like a child again, standing before the invisible wall that had always separated me from her affection. Daniel spoke about the inheritance as if it were a natural correction of history. "She wanted me to build something better with it," he said, his tone filled with pride. I wanted to scream, to ask why she thought I couldn't. But the look on his face stopped me, the same look his father used to give when I questioned his authority. Cold, certain, final. When he left, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the will once more. My reflection on the glass surface looked like that of a stranger. Somewhere between that letter and my son's indifference, I realized I had lost both, my mother and my child, in the same breath. The lawyer's office smelled of paper, ink, and formality, the kind of place where people pretend that pain can be settled with signatures. I sat across from him, Daniel at my side, though we might as well have been strangers. The old man adjusted his glasses and began reading, each word landing like a hammer on stone. He spoke of assets, land titles, and accounts I never knew existed. Every time he mentioned Daniel's name, my heart sank deeper. There was no pause, no hesitation. My mother had left him everything. When he finished, he looked at me with the awkward sympathy professionals use when they've seen too many families fall apart. "Your mother wanted this to be clear," he said softly. Daniel nodded, as if confirming something already agreed upon. "I understand," he replied, signing the papers with steady hands. I wanted to ask the lawyer if there had been another version, a missing page, something that could explain this cruelty. But his face said it all. There wasn't. When we stepped outside, Daniel didn't look at me. He just said, "You'll be fine, Mom. You don't need much anyway." It was meant to sound practical, but it felt like a dismissal, a quiet exile. The world around me blurred as he walked ahead, sunlight hitting his hair just like it did when he was a child. Only now, there was no innocence left. I stood on the steps of that office holding a copy of the will, but it felt more like a gravestone, not for my mother, but for the love that had once connected us all. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Days passed, but the words from that will echoed in my head like a curse. "Forgive me when you find out why." I couldn't escape them. Every night I lay awake, wondering what truth could possibly justify being erased from my own mother's life. The house felt heavier, the silence more suffocating. It was as if her spirit lingered, watching me struggle to piece together a puzzle I never asked to solve. I began searching through her old belongings. Boxes of faded photographs, letters tied with ribbons, drawers full of perfumes that had long lost their scent. I didn't know what I was looking for, only that I couldn't stop. Grief had turned into obsession, and the feeling that something wasn't right grew stronger by the hour. One evening, I found a small wooden box hidden behind the wardrobe. It was carved with initials I didn't recognize, HM, not my father's, not hers. My heart raced. Inside, there were a few papers, a golden locket, and a folded photograph of a man standing next to my mother, holding an infant. The man wasn't my father, and the baby looked like Daniel. For a moment, the air left my lungs. I turned the photo over, and in my mother's elegant handwriting, it said, "For the one who carries the truth." My hands trembled. Could it be? Could my mother's secret be tied not just to her past, but to my son's blood? I felt a chill run through me. That phrase, "Forgive me when you find out why," no longer sounded like an apology. It felt like a warning. I couldn't sleep after finding that photograph. The image of that man's face haunted me, familiar yet strange, as if he'd been erased from family history on purpose. At dawn, I went back to my mother's house, the one now legally belonging to Daniel. The place was untouched, frozen in time. Her perfume still lingered in the curtains, and I could almost hear her footsteps upstairs. In the bedroom, I noticed a loose board beneath the dresser. My mother had always been meticulous. Nothing in her world was out of place. I pried it open and found a small leather-bound journal, wrapped in a yellowed piece of lace. It was old, the kind of old that smells like truth. My heart pounded as I opened it. The first pages were filled with ordinary memories, holidays, recipes, weather notes. But deeper in, her handwriting changed. The letters grew heavier, as if guilt itself pressed the ink onto the paper. She wrote about a man named Henry, a name I'd never heard in my family before. She wrote about a mistake, a forbidden love, and a child born under silence. Each page unraveled a new layer of deceit. My father had been away for months, and during that time, Henry appeared, a friend of the family, a comfort she wasn't supposed to seek. And when I realized what she meant by the child, I froze.
She wasn't talking about me.
She was talking about Daniel. The diary slipped from my hands. My son. My mother. The truth was beginning to form, dark and unbearable, Yet I knew I had to keep reading. Somewhere in those pages lay the reason I had lost everything. The next morning, I returned to the diary with trembling hands. I wasn't sure if I wanted answers anymore, but ignorance was no longer an option. The pages turned brittle as I read, as though time itself wanted to hide what had been written. My mother described her affair with Henry in detail that made my heart ache, not for her sins, but for her loneliness. She had been trapped in a loveless marriage, silenced by duty and appearances. But then came the line that changed everything. When Anna was away at university, he came back. I couldn't resist the comfort of being seen again. And soon after, Daniel was born. My mind went blank. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The truth wasn't just forbidden, it was unbearable. My son, my only son, wasn't just my child. He was the living reminder of my mother's greatest betrayal. I felt dizzy, as though the walls of the room were closing in on me. All those years, her affection for Daniel had always seemed excessive, almost unnatural. Now I understood why. He wasn't just her grandson. He was her son's son, and her own son's bloodline twisted into shame. A generation of silence born from sin. I walked to the mirror and barely recognized the reflection. How do you live with the knowledge that your child's existence carries the echo of your mother's secret? That your bloodline is tangled in deceit and shame? I wanted to hate her, to curse her name. But deep down, part of me understood her weakness because I, too, had once loved someone I wasn't supposed to. That night, I burned the first few pages of the diary. I told myself it was to protect Daniel from ever knowing. But in truth, it was to protect myself from becoming the next woman in our family destroyed by the weight of the truth. I didn't open the diary again for several days. Every time I looked at it, I felt as though it stared back at me, daring me to finish what I had started. But grief and curiosity share the same hunger. They both demand to be fed. So one night, when the house was quiet and the only sound was the old clock ticking in the hall, I returned to those pages that smelled of dust and confession. This time, the tone of my mother's writing was different. It wasn't passion or shame anymore. It was sorrow. She wrote about living each day in fear that I would find out the truth. How she watched me raise Daniel, torn between love and guilt, unable to tell me that the boy I adored carried the blood of her own mistake. She wrote, "I couldn't punish you for what you didn't do, but I couldn't forgive myself either." Then came the final confession. I left everything to Daniel because he was born from my sin. I wanted to give him a future free from the shadow I cast. I hoped that in doing so, you might be freed from me. I read those words over and over until they lost all meaning. She hadn't disinherited me out of cruelty. She had done it out of desperation to make peace with herself. But the truth doesn't bring peace. It only changes the shape of the wound. My mother had tried to cleanse her conscience by giving Daniel everything, yet in doing so, she had poisoned the bond between us. She'd freed her soul and chained mine. I closed the diary, tears finally coming after weeks of silence. I whispered into the empty room, "You wanted forgiveness, Mother, but all you gave me was silence." When Daniel came to visit a few days later, I felt my pulse racing before he even stepped inside. I had spent nights rehearsing what to say, how to begin, how to tell him that everything he believed about our family was a lie. But when I saw his face, calm, distant, self-assured, the words died in my throat. He looked at me like a stranger who happened to share his last name. "I know why she did it," I said finally, forcing the tremor out of my voice. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of unease crossing his expression. "Your grandmother. I know why she left everything to you." He leaned back, arms crossed, waiting like a judge about to hear a confession. "You shouldn't have gone through her things," he said flatly. The tone wasn't surprise, it was warning. The realization struck me like cold water. He already knew. My son had known the truth long before I did. My mother hadn't just trusted him, she had made him part of her secret. The betrayal felt deeper than I could bear. "You knew she betrayed me, and you said nothing?" I whispered. He didn't flinch. "She didn't betray you, Mom. She trusted me to protect the family's name." Something inside me broke then. Protect it from what? I shouted. From the truth. My voice echoed through the kitchen, and for a moment, even Daniel seemed shaken. But instead of remorse, there was pity in his eyes. Pity for me, as though I were too fragile to understand the bigger picture. That look hurt more than his words. When he left, I sank to the floor, clutching the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. I had lost him, not to death, but to pride. The bloodline that bound us had become a chain of lies. And now, even truth had no power to free us. I waited until dusk to visit the cemetery, the hour when the world grows quiet enough for the dead to whisper. The sky was the color of bruised violets, and the air carried that scent of wet earth that always reminded me of my mother's garden. I brought no flowers, only the questions she left behind. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes as I walked between the stones, my breath misting in the cold. Her grave looked different now. The flowers Daniel had left were fresh, white lilies her favorite, but there was something odd about their arrangement. They were placed too perfectly, like they were meant to hide something rather than honor her. I knelt down, brushing the petals aside, and that's when I saw it, an envelope, tucked between the stems, sealed with the same wax symbol as her last letter. My heart pounded. For a moment, I couldn't move. My fingers hovered above it, trembling. I whispered, "What more could you possibly have to say?" The wind picked up, almost as if urging me to take it. I opened the seal carefully, afraid it might crumble in my hands. Inside was a short letter written in that same familiar hand. The ink had faded, but the pain behind the words hadn't. "If you found this, my Anna, then the truth has already hurt you. But remember, what you carry is not your fault. I could not undo what I did, but I could try to protect you from the same mistake. Love Daniel as your son, not as my shame. The blood may be twisted, but love can still be pure." I pressed the paper to my chest and closed my eyes. The tears came not from anger this time, but from exhaustion, from the cruel mercy of a woman who had loved too deeply and sinned even deeper. I finally understood. Her will wasn't a punishment. It was a confession disguised as inheritance. When I got home, I sat by the window with the letter trembling in my hands. The rain had begun to fall again, soft at first, then steady, like the sky was mourning with me. I unfolded the fragile paper, smoothing its edges as if I were holding my mother's hand one last time. The words blurred for a moment behind my tears, but I forced myself to read, slowly, carefully, like every sentence was a thread pulling me closer to her ghost. "I watched you raise him," she wrote, "and I saw in your eyes the strength I never had. You loved him without knowing, and that love was pure, untouched by my sins. You were the mother I could never be, Anna. I gave him to you, so he could have the life I stole for myself." I paused, feeling the ache in every word. My mother had not only hidden her shame, she had entrusted me with its redemption. The next lines were harder to read. "When I told him the truth, I did it to free him from the burden of secrecy. But I realize now that I only chained you both in silence. If he ever turns against you, forgive him. He carries the confusion of two mothers and one truth too heavy for youth." My vision blurred again, and I could almost hear her voice, soft, regretful, filled with that quiet authority that once ruled my childhood. She ended with a final plea. "Don't let the truth destroy what love once built. I leave you nothing, Anna, because love cannot be divided. It must be chosen. And I choose you to forgive me." For the first time in weeks, I cried not from betrayal, but from something closer to release. I looked around the empty house, the ticking clock, the scent of rain, the echo of her words lingering in the air. I whispered into the silence, "I forgive you, Mother, but I don't know if I can forgive him." The letter didn't stay hidden for long. Daniel came to visit 2 days later, unannounced as always, his voice echoing through the hallway before I could even greet him. "You went to the cemetery," he said flatly. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. My hands froze around the cup of tea I'd been holding. He stepped closer, his gaze sharp. "You found something, didn't you?" I didn't want to lie. There was no point anymore. I reached for the drawer and pulled out the letter, folded and worn from my trembling fingers. "It was from your grandmother," I said softly. "You deserve to read it." For a moment, his expression faltered, just a flicker of vulnerability, before pride took over again. He snatched the paper and read it in silence. I watched his jaw tighten, his breathing quicken. When he finished, he looked at me like I was a stranger. "You shouldn't have shown me this," he hissed. "Do you realize what you've done? You're trying to ruin her memory, our family's name." His voice rose, cracking under the weight of anger he didn't understand. "She trusted me, not you. And now you're trying to twist her words because you can't stand what she chose." His words struck harder than any slap. I tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. "Daniel," I pleaded, "this letter proves she loved us both. Differently, yes, but she was asking for peace." He stepped back, shaking his head. "You've always wanted her gone. And now that she is, you can't stand that she loved me more." The room went cold. I realized then that my mother's sin hadn't just broken her life, it had poisoned his. The truth I had carried to heal us had become a weapon in his hands. And as he left, slamming the door behind him, I knew I had lost him completely. The days that followed were hollow, stripped of warmth. Daniel stopped calling, stopped visiting. When he finally appeared again, it wasn't as a son coming home, it was as a stranger delivering a verdict. He arrived with that same cold expression I'd seen at the lawyer's office, his eyes fixed on some place beyond me, as if I were no longer part of his world. He didn't sit down. "I've decided to sell the house," he said simply. My throat went dry. "Daniel, this is my home," I whispered. "It's where you were born." He didn't flinch. "It's mine now. Grandma left it to me, remember? You can stay somewhere smaller, something that fits your needs." The words were practical, but beneath them was venom. It wasn't about property. It was punishment. I stood frozen, trying to understand how love could turn into this, into indifference wearing the mask of responsibility. "You're angry because of the letter," I said. "But she wanted us to forgive." He laughed, a sound that didn't belong to the boy I raised. "Forgive? She destroyed everything, and you're defending her. You always lived in her shadow. Maybe now you'll finally learn what it's like to lose control." My hands trembled. "Daniel, please. Don't let her mistakes become yours." He turned toward the door. "You should start packing." That was all he said before walking away, leaving me standing in the silence of a house that no longer belonged to me, nor to the love that had once lived within its walls. That night, I sat on the empty floor, surrounded by boxes and memories, realizing that losing your child while they're still alive is a grief no burial can prepare you for. The inheritance that was meant to free him had chained his heart in pride. After Daniel left, the house fell into a silence, so deep it felt alive. Every creak in the wood, every sigh of wind through the window seemed to whisper his name. I moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, a place without memories, without ghosts, without the sound of his footsteps echoing down the hallway. The first night there, I sat on the floor surrounded by boxes and asked the darkness if a mother ever truly stops waiting. Days turned into weeks, then months. Seasons passed unnoticed. I stopped cooking for two, stopped setting the table, stopped expecting his voice on the phone. Instead, I learned the language of solitude, the quiet routines that keep grief from swallowing you whole. Sometimes I'd walk to the park and see mothers with their grown sons, arguing about trivial things, laughing afterward. It used to hurt. Then it just made me tired. I kept my mother's letter in a small drawer beside my bed. I read it often, though I could recite every word by heart. Over time, I began to hear her voice differently, not as the woman who betrayed me, but as someone begging from the other side of her own pain. It made me wonder if Daniel would ever hear mine that way too. Years drifted by. The world moved on without me, and I became invisible, a quiet figure in the background of other people's lives. But even as my hair turned white and my hands grew frail, the ache in my chest never left. It wasn't bitterness anymore. It was something softer, sadder. The residue of love that has nowhere left to go. Sometimes, late at night, I'd dream of the house. In the dream, Daniel was a boy again, running through the garden, calling for me. I'd turned to answer him, but the voice never came out. I always woke up before he reached me, my pillow wet with tears I no longer tried to hide. It was a cold morning in late autumn when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. I rarely did anymore. But something in the stillness made me reach for it, a quiet instinct that told me this call would change everything. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, calm, professional. "Mrs. Wallace? This is St. Mary's Hospital. Your son, Daniel, asked for you." My breath caught. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The nurse explained that he'd been admitted 2 days earlier, complications from a condition he'd kept secret for years. "He said he wants to see you," she added softly, as if she understood how heavy those words were. I sat there for a long time after hanging up, staring at the quiet apartment that had been both my prison and my refuge. The part of me that had promised never to forgive him fought against the one that still remembered the warmth of his small hand in mine. When I finally stood, I saw my reflection in the mirror by the door, an old woman, pale and trembling, but alive with purpose for the first time in years. I gathered the letter, the diary, and a small photograph of Daniel as a child. I didn't know what I was going to say, or if I even should. But love, even broken, has its own gravity. It pulls you back, no matter how far you try to run. The road to the hospital felt endless. Every mile seemed to replay our story in fragments, his laughter, his anger, the day he walked away. By the time I arrived, I was shaking, unsure if I could face him. The nurse led me to his room, and when I saw him lying there, pale and smaller than I remembered, time folded in on itself. He opened his eyes slowly. For a moment, he didn't recognize me. Then his lips trembled. "Mom," he whispered. And just like that, the years of silence vanished into a single word. The room was dim, filled with the slow rhythm of machines and the faint scent of antiseptic. Daniel looked fragile, his skin pale against the white sheets, his once proud posture dissolved into weakness. For a moment, I just stood there, afraid that if I spoke, the illusion would shatter and he'd disappear. But then his eyes met mine, tired, glassy, but full of something I hadn't seen in years. Recognition. He tried to smile. "You came," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, swallowing the ache in my throat. "Of course I came, Daniel. You're my son." The words trembled out of me, as if I'd been holding them hostage all those years. He looked away, blinking back tears. "I thought you'd hate me forever," he said. I sat beside him, my hand brushing his. "I did for a while," I admitted. "But hate fades. Love doesn't." He turned his face toward the window, the weak sunlight tracing the outline of his jaw. "She told me everything before she died," he murmured. "I thought I could carry the truth, protect her memory, but it only poisoned me. I blamed you because it was easier." His voice cracked. "I was wrong, Mom." The sound of that word, Mom, undid me. I hadn't realized how much I missed hearing it until that moment. Tears blurred my vision as I held his hand tightly. "We were all victims of her silence," I said softly. "But maybe that silence ends here." He nodded weakly, his eyes glistening. "Do you forgive me?" he asked. My voice broke as I whispered, "I forgave you the moment you stopped being my son and became my pain." He smiled faintly, a shadow of the boy he once was. "Then I can go in peace," he said. And in that fragile moment, surrounded by the hum of machines and the weight of years lost, I realized that forgiveness doesn't heal the past. It only makes the present bearable. The funeral was small, quieter than my mother's, almost tender in its simplicity. A few friends from his work came, some nurses from the hospital, and me. Just me. I stood by his casket with the same numbness I'd felt years ago, staring at another goodbye that life had forced upon me. I thought there were no more tears left, but grief always finds a way to remind us that love never dies. It just changes form. A week later, I received a letter from the same law firm that had once read my mother's will. The irony didn't escape me. I almost didn't go, afraid of what paper and ink might take from me this time. But something inside urged me to face it, maybe closure, maybe penance. The lawyer, older now and gentler, greeted me with a sad smile. "Your son left something for you, Mrs. Wallace," he said. He handed me an envelope sealed with Daniel's handwriting. Inside was his own will, short, almost hesitant. "To my mother, Anna Wallace, I leave everything that was once taken from her. The house, the land, the accounts. But more than that, I leave her the truth. She was the only one who ever loved me without condition." My breath caught. My hands trembled as I read those words again and again until they blurred into tears. For years, I had begged the universe for one last sign that forgiveness meant something, that my love hadn't been in vain. And there it was, written in the same pen that once signed my exile. It wasn't wealth he returned to me. It was peace. I walked home slowly that day, the autumn air cold against my skin, the world moving softly around me. For the first time in decades, the silence inside me didn't ache. It listened, because somewhere beyond the veil of regret and time, I felt my son and my mother, not as ghosts, but as love finally unburdened. Years passed, and the world around me grew quieter. My body weakened, my steps slowed, but inside, I felt a stillness that I had never known, the kind that only comes when there's nothing left to lose and nothing left to prove. I moved into a nursing home by the sea, where the waves whispered like old friends, carrying the voices of those I had loved and lost. I kept Daniel's letter beside my bed, folded neatly in the same envelope he had signed. I read it every night, not to remember him, but to remind myself that forgiveness had finally found its place. One morning, the nurse brought me an envelope with the law firm seal. "It was delayed," she said softly. "Your son left this to be delivered years after his passing." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, his handwriting faint but steady. "Mom, if you're reading this, it means time has done what neither of us could: heal. I hope you found peace. I hope you forgave yourself too. The house by the hill is yours again. But if you ever feel lonely, go there and listen. You'll hear us." Tears welled in my eyes, but they weren't heavy. They were gentle, like rain that nourishes rather than destroys. I could almost hear his voice, not the angry tone that once cut through me, but the boyish laugh that used to fill my kitchen. I whispered, "I do hear you, my son," and the wind outside seemed to answer, brushing lightly against the window pane. That night, I dreamed of the house. It was full of light, and both Daniel and my mother stood in the garden, smiling as if nothing had ever been broken. My mother held out her hand, and Daniel reached for mine. There were no words, only a warmth that filled the space between us, the kind of peace no inheritance could buy. When I awoke, the sunrise painted the room gold. I placed the letter on my chest, closed my eyes, and smiled. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel alone. I felt home. As the days grew shorter and my body weaker, I often found myself staring out the window, watching the sea breathe. Life, I realized, was not meant to be understood, only forgiven. The tide rolled in and out, erasing the footprints of yesterday, the same way forgiveness erases the sharp edges of memory. I had spent years trying to make sense of why people hurt the ones they love, but in the end, I learned that love and pain are born from the same soil. You cannot have one without planting the other. I used to believe that truth would set me free. Now I know it only changes the kind of prison you live in. What truly sets you free is mercy, not for others, but for yourself. My mother carried her sins like chains, and I carried my resentment like armor. Both of us suffered under the weight of what we refused to release. It took losing everything, her, my son, even my home, to understand that forgiveness is not about who deserves it, but about who needs peace the most. I think about Daniel often. Not the man who shouted at me, but the boy who used to bring me dandelions from the garden, calling them sunflowers for you, Mom. That memory alone is enough to make every scar on my heart feel sacred. Love doesn't vanish when life does, it lingers, waiting to be remembered. Sometimes the nurses ask me if I regret not having had another child. I smile and tell them no. I was given one, and he was both my blessing and my lesson. From him, I learned that the deepest love isn't the one that saves us, it's the one that teaches us how to let go. And so, as the sea hums its endless lullaby outside my window, I whisper my final truth to whoever may listen. We inherit many things in life: names, houses, secrets. But the only inheritance worth keeping is forgiveness. That night, the ocean was calm, a mirror of the sky, where stars glimmered like promises finally kept. I lay in my bed with the window open, letting the wind carry the scent of salt and eternity. My hands rested over Daniel's letter, the paper soft and worn from years of holding it close. The nurses had already turned off the lights, but I didn't feel alone. I could feel them, both of them, near. My mother's warmth in the air, my son's presence in the rhythm of the sea. The clock ticked softly, steady as a heartbeat. I thought of everything we had been through, the lies, the pride, the silence. And yet, beneath it all, there was always love. Imperfect, broken, disguised as pain, but love nonetheless. I realized then that forgiveness is not something we give once. It's something we live every day until it becomes part of who we are. My breath grew slower, lighter. I wasn't afraid. The fear that had followed me all my life, of not being enough, of being forgotten, had vanished. In its place, there was gratitude. Gratitude for the moments, even the painful ones, that shaped me into something gentler. I whispered to the darkness, "I forgive you, Mother, and I forgive myself too." Then, a warmth spread across the room, brighter than any lamp. I saw Daniel standing at the doorway, smiling like the boy he once was, and behind him, my mother, her face free of sorrow. They reached out their hands, and I felt my heart lift, lighter than breath. The room dissolved into light, into peace, into everything I had been waiting for. And in that final moment, I understood, love never ends, it only changes where it lives. The sea sang its lullaby one last time, and I let go, not into darkness, but into home. The end.